Rangers lead the way is the motto we conquered on bloody Omaha Beach, and it is the phrase that characterizes us best. Before Ranger School, I served in the Rakkasans. But when I got out, I was offered a position in the 75th Ranger Regiment, which supposedly traces its lineage back to the Rogers Rangers who made their mark in France and India. I then spent an intense period of quality time in Paktia province working with locals on both sides of the Afghan border. The Pashtun are a tough and ruthless people, which perhaps explains why Afghanistan has been a break for all Western countries, from the Macedonians, the British, the Russians to us. Most guys stay all of 20 when they get a Ranger flash. But my opinion was changed by one incident. It was a moonless night, and we were on duty at a checkpoint on the Kabul-Gardez road. Ranger units are not used for routine business. But G2 had gotten word that there was going to be an explosion at the university in Gardez, and our unit was the only available force. There is absolute darkness in the valleys of the Hindu Kush, and you get the impression that you are the last people on earth sitting on a deserted stretch of road in this ancient and unforgiving country. Around midnight we heard the scrambling of something large approaching our position. We turned on our tack flashlights to warn whoever it was to stop. What we illuminated was a large cement truck, and it was heading toward us at high speed. We flashed our beat lights, but nothing happened. We blinked again, but still did not slow down. At this point, the car was no more than 100 yards away from us. Everyone realized that the mixer might have enough Semtex or C4 in it to blow us all to smithereens, and it wasn't stopping. So Top told us to set it on fire. I emptied the 30-round box magazine of my SAU, and I think I was the most restrained member of the squad. The juggernaut coming at us was so intimidating. Eventually the truck stopped. The first daredevil who examined it found no explosives, only cement. The problem was that there was an older guy and 2 children in the truck. A 13-year-old was driving. The older guy appeared to be sleeping in the back seat. We didn't get a chance to ask the 13-year-old why he didn't stop. Because both he, his father, and his brother were unequivocally dead. We suffered no consequences. We did everything by the book. But I still couldn't get rid of the image of those 2 boys and the bloody cab. So at the end of the term, I gave up the service. I'd had enough killing. Now I wanted to help people. I decided that the best way to accomplish this goal was to go into medicine. I realized that at 31, I was too old for traditional medical school training. In addition, I had no academic training. But the physician assistant program seemed like something I could handle. I was nervous going into the interview. I had an admissions advantage because of my veteran status. But I got one of those online bachelor's degrees. It was biology, not nursing or anything medical. Nevertheless, 6 years as a combat corpsman made me very qualified in their eyes. Once you get into a Ranger unit, you're a primer until someone tells you otherwise. So I never fell under the definition of Article 25. But I did attend an 18-week medical training course at Fort Sam Houston, and that MOS was what I did in our unit. Accordingly, in the fall of that year, I attended classes at Western University School of Medicine and Public Health, located between 2 lakes off Delaplane Court. This was my first introduction to a medical institution. Medicine, like the military, has its own hoops of fire, and I quickly realized my place in the grand scheme of things. Members of the medical faculty were at the top of the food chain. They usually walked to work right through the water of Lake Mendota. Then came the medical students. Oddly enough, their shit didn't stink. The hospital administration and health officials thought all doctors were incompetent, especially when it came to the essence of providing quality healthcare paperwork. Then there were the nurses and PA students. We were too numerous and unimportant to be noticed by the great and the good. The student body itself was a revelation, especially for a guy with my background. I enlisted in the Army when I was 18, and almost half of my life was spent in strict military discipline. So it was hard to get along with my peers. Mostly because they were younger than me and had never faced what I had to face. You grow up fast in the military. From day one in boot camp you are taught personal responsibility, and there is nothing like daily foot patrols in places like Kandahar or Gardez to teach you about your own mortality. My fellow students had never had that experience. So they all seemed juvenile, especially because of the constant pussy hunting and partying. Physician assistants provide primary care, diagnosis, and treatment in hard-to-reach places. Of course, this happens under the divine eye of a real doctor, as many of the doctors like to point out. So, I was practicing family medicine at a small clinic southeast of Eau Claire. The place wasn't exactly Chicago, and it wasn't even exactly Eau Claire. It was a small town of 1,500 people just outside of the Wisconsin Dells. It was a wonderful, time-forgotten place, soft and peaceful, and it was starting to make the nightmares go away. I had seen too much death in my previous life and was beginning to realize where I belonged. Small Wisconsin towns are in the middle of nowhere. So from a family medicine standpoint, I was the only candidate in town. I was already licensed. I had passed the PANCE exam when I graduated high school and could write prescriptions. But I still had to work on orders from a licensed physician. My supervisor was a local family doctor. Dr. Morton had virtually no patient care. He only showed up occasionally to show the flag. He had lived in the village all his life, except for his time in UW Medical School, and looked and acted like a refugee from a 1930s movie about a dusty chimney. He was a pleasant older man who had faithfully served his community for over 50 years. I think he saw me as a son, for he was always kind and helpful to me. The office itself was in a building on Main Street. It was small, mostly a registrar, myself and a nurse. Nurses traveled from Madison for clinical assignments. They were mostly 22 to 23-year-old undergraduate nurses who had just graduated or were finishing their degrees. The town was not the kind of town one goes to for fun. So my younger nurses usually gravitated toward Eau Claire, where they spent their evenings. The fact that the girls traveled to Eau Claire for the nightlife should give you an idea of how interesting and vibrant our little town was. I was almost 34 at the time, and my only goal was to settle down. The problem was that I had no one to settle down with, although the locals didn't try. I was their version of the town doctor, and there were plenty of unmarried women who made their interest clear. Nevertheless, in my Army career, I had met women of all types, from the cotillions at Fort Bragg to the whores of Kabul. So the women in this place didn't have what it took to interest a pampered guy like me. Everything changed one spring morning. Wisconsin in the winter is horrible. The snow is knee-deep, the colors are black and white, and the air is so cold it freezes your nose hairs. Then the weather changes, the sun peeks out, it gets warm, green leaves appear, and it's May. I was informed that UW Family Medicine was sending a new nurse practitioner to work, who had asked for it herself. This was surprising in itself, as most of the nurses sent felt they were being penalized. I called the doctor and he and I waited behind the counter to interview the new girl. While we were waiting, the door opened and a woman walked in. She was breathtaking. She was Swedish blonde, her long, very thick, almost blonde hair framing a perfect face. She looked like she had just stepped off the cover of a sports magazine, about 5'6", slim and obviously fit, with long, beautiful muscular legs and a modest business-length skirt. She was about 29 years old. I should have been happy about her unexpected appearance. In fact, however, I was a little annoyed. This was a woman any man would want to get to know better. But instead I got to interview a painfully sincere female nursing student. This illustrated the time crunch I'd been experiencing lately. When I saw a woman I liked, I was either doing something else or she was in the process of doing some discouraging activity, such as walking down the street with her husband and children. I said curtly, "Please have a seat, miss. We will attend to you as soon as we can." She said, "Dr. Morton?" Doc replied, "Yes." She looked a little puzzled and asked me, "Who are you?" I replied, perhaps too sharply, "I'm his assistant." "How can we help you?" She replied just as sharply, "My name is Eva Peterson, and I was supposed to interview with Dr. Morton for the clinical nurse position." Holy smokes! This amazing woman was the one we had been waiting for. Needless to say, I started to backtrack. I said, trying not to give away my excitement, "I'm sorry, Miss Peterson, we were expecting someone much younger." "Oh my God. I'm such a fool." She smiled at my embarrassment. She knew the effect she had on men. She replied, I earned my undergraduate degree on a Navy ROTC scholarship, so I served 4 years on active duty in the Marine Corps. She added, I was in the reserves when I was in Chicago studying for my master's in nursing practice, and it took me a while. Great. She was a squid, an officer, and probably more qualified than me. At that moment, Doc intervened. He sat watching me twist in the wind with an expression of amused condescension on his face. He said, we were expecting to SA. EA fourth-year undergraduate student, Eva. Not someone as highly qualified as you. What made you apply for such a position? She smiled radiantly at my good old friend and replied, I was born and raised on Buckman Street, document don't you remember me? I was a skinny little girl then. But my mom still owns the Hotspot Cafe. Doc looked at her stunned and said, is that your Doris girl? She grinned even wider and replied, in the flesh. It was quite impressive flesh. She came around the corner and hugged the old man, carefully avoiding me. Okay. I was a complete moron. She said, I've been to a lot of places with Marines. Some of them were pretty pathetic. I had a wonderful childhood, and now I want to go home forever. It would take too long to list all the thoughts that swarmed in my head. A beautiful, educated, and socialite woman wanted to work in a place where I was beginning to put down roots. She had about as much service as I had, with some obviously having served. She had a great medical reputation. Even better, there was no way we could avoid being around each other for a significant portion of each day. The interview was short, mostly background checks. We're willing to take anyone Madison sends. But the polite thing to do is to at least look like you're being selective. The whole time she spoke, Eve sat with her knees together, speaking in the disciplined voice of a naval lieutenant. Of course, her voice was low, soft, and incredibly sensual. I had a thought, but I knew I couldn't voice it without getting in trouble with the EEOC. Is she married? I realized that my immediate interest in her marital status made me look like a horn dog. But Eva Peterson was just so attractive. I knew I could ask her about her service record, which might give me a clue as to her marital status. I found out that she had served in Balad in Iraq and 2 tours of duty at Craig, Bagram, that is, while I was down south. So she understood everything. It didn't take more than 10 seconds to decide that she was a good fit for us, since she'd probably be better off practicing medicine in some Chicago place rather than here. Doc asked, where are you going to live, Eve? She brightened up and replied, with Mom, she has too much room after Dad died. Doc said, yes, I remember, it was last year, wasn't it? We were all very sorry. He was a good man. Then he added conversationally, so what made you come back here? After all, for a woman with your background, it's quite a slow journey, isn't it? He didn't add, and with your beauty. Nevertheless, I thought about it. She looked sad and said, I married an absolutely horrible man just after I finished my service in the Navy. I have no idea why I did it, but he was so persistent in getting me. I should have been stronger, but he was so persistent, and eventually I gave in. She seemed embarrassed, adding, I tried, I really did. But one horrible night in Barcelona, I finally accepted that he didn't love me. I was just his property. The way I realized it is too personal to describe. But it gave me the courage to divorce him. After the divorce, I was empty and apathetic, just drifting. Then I came back here for my dad's funeral and felt like I fit in. This simple place was the happiest place I've ever been, and it's where I want to be now, forever. So I'm looking forward to making a fresh start, and this time I'm not going to leave. Of course, my selfish personal reaction was, she's free. Thus began our life together, family medicine for the residents of Eau Claire County. I was the pinnacle of the chain of command, as Doc Morton practically handed over all aspects of the business to me. He was still kind and gracious to me. But he was already in his 70s. Everything was just idyllic. We provided routine primary care, basic diagnosis and treatment, referrals to Madison if we couldn't diagnose or were faced with something serious. Eva handled patient intake and, for the most part, everything that concerned women in the neighborhood. I did everything else, children, families, and the occasional female patient. My life was very fulfilling. I was a pillar of the community, I was loved and respected by everyone in town, and I worked side by side with a woman who was both beautiful and an excellent friend and companion. Perhaps our beginning was rather awkward. But by the end of the first month, we were as comfortable as a man and a woman can be with each other. Mostly because it was just the two of us in the office and we were doing it 8 to 10 hours a day. But it was also due to the influence of Eva's mother, Doris. I knew Doris from the diner. She was one of those people you only find in a small town. I lived almost next door to her diner. So I had breakfast there every morning. It kept me connected to the community. But it also kept my finger on the pulse, so to speak. The diner was the place where all the events in the neighborhood took place. Accordingly, Doris was the place to go if you wanted to know what was going on. Her diner had been the center of town life for at least 30 years, she knew everyone and everyone knew her. She clearly loved her daughter and seemed to have a vested interest in me, like a surrogate mother. I lived in a little bungalow. It was a bachelor life, just me and my dog Buster. I got Buster from a shelter in Madison. He is big and ugly, unconditionally loyal and loving. Anyone who still suffers from hyperconsciousness and other symptoms of PTSD needs the calming influence of a dog. So Buster will faithfully sit by the front desk to let me know who loves me. A big scruffy mutt doesn't belong in a medical office. But no one gave Buster away, and in many ways he was as well known in the neighborhood as I was. Anyone who's ever been a ranger can fend for themselves. But Eva's mother Doris seemed to think I'd starve to death on my own. So every Sunday, Buster and I were invited to the Petersons' house to get the same kind of trashing I had experienced growing up in a German family. The Peterson house was one of those classic 2.5-story stone colonial houses you see all over Wisconsin. It was large and substantial, light and airy, and every time I visited it smelled like Thanksgiving. Buster and I never missed a Sunday, both for the same reason, the food. Doris owned a diner, so she was a great cook. But Eva was a first-class doctor, not a chef, so the question arose, why is Eva such a good cook? Actually, Eva could make food that could feed an entire infantry brigade, and her cooking ability was a little better than her mom's. One Sunday night I was sitting in their living room after Eva fed me something that tasted like it came from Louis Quatorze's kitchen. Eva was doing the cooking because Doris had to work the evening shift at the diner. So we were alone. Buster leaned against my leg, the way all big dogs do when they express affection. Eva was fussing around me in a cute Brady mom apron that looked like something out of the 1950s. It was an absurd sight, as it was the complete opposite of who Eva was and what she looked like in her regular clothes. She walked over, sat down in the chair opposite and said, "Can I ask you a personal question?" I laughed and replied, "After you feed me like that, you can ask my whole life story, including all the dirty little secrets." She asked, "Are you gay?" I said, "Excuse me." She replied, "I was wondering why you've never made a pass. Is it because you play for the other team?" I was just wondering. She was serious. I said, "I never hit on you because you are my colleague, we work together." She replied, "What does that have to do with it? Every man I've ever worked with has tried to do something to me." This caused me to have an unreasonable fit of jealousy, but I pulled myself together and calmly said, "It's not that I don't find you attractive. You're stunning. But I want to work with you for the rest of my career, if I have anything to say about it, and I'd hate to ruin it over an affair." I added, "I have infinite respect for you. You are an excellent nurse, and it would be simply disrespectful of me to probe you while we are caring for the good people of this county." She replied, "Okay, I understand. But we're the only ones here on Sunday. If you did this now, it would be a sign that you find me attractive, that you really want me." Then she hesitated and said in a whisper, "As much as I want you. And now, finally, it's all out in the open." I suppose it was inevitable. We were two healthy young men. We had worked together as closely as two people can work, for almost a year. During that time, I never once missed an opportunity to ogle her firm, round ass, taut thighs, tiny waist, and perfect little breasts. I guess she was doing the same to me. We worked as a close-knit team and anticipated each other's thoughts, so much so that it felt like we were an old married couple. The citizens of Eau Claire County depended on us, and our sense of accomplishment and respect kept us in a contented state of camaraderie that was truly fertile ground for the seeds of love to germinate. The beautiful woman I admired and lusted after had just offered herself to me, and I knew I wasn't going to disappoint the poor girl. But before the blood rushed to my lower control center, my upper brain had to get one thing straight. I looked at her as frankly as I could and said, if we get intimate, I want us to have a real relationship, not just fucking. We have to work together anyway, and sex always messes up the team dynamic. So I'm not interested in it if it's going to be a one-time thing, just to have a little fun after dinner tonight. I looked at her with an expression that I hoped conveyed my seriousness and said, you're too special to me to be just a casual fling. So you're going to have to tell me that you want something deeper and more personal. If you can't make that commitment, I want us both to be able to walk out the door tonight and forget you even talked about it. She looked at me as if I had finally discovered something that everyone else in the world already knew. She said simply, I'm in love with you, Jonathan. I have been for a very long time. I want everything you're capable of giving me. And I want it forever. Is that clear enough for you? I remember walking together to her large but cozy bedroom. Perfect things like this don't happen to me. I turned her to face me, putting my hands on both shoulders. She was already breathing raggedly. I stared into those huge, ice blue eyes, and she looked at me with undisguised love. You couldn't fake that look. She stepped toward me, put her hands on either side of my face, and pulled me to her in a heated kiss. She moaned loudly, her mouth opened wide, and we began to exchange tongues. Then she grabbed the back of my head with one hand and put the other around my shoulders and pressed herself against me. I started to lead her back to the bed. She made soft cooing noises. At the same time, she put both hands down to break my belt. We reached her bed and I pushed her back onto it. She was still holding onto my belt, which, as she fell, tore at the loops and right off of me. In doing so, my pants fell to the floor. They rolled up around my ankles, and I tripped over them and fell face forward, tucking my nose between her wide-open legs. Okay, it was a Keystone Cops moment, but you had to start somewhere. So I tackled the prospect that was standing right in front of me. I pulled down her panties and began licking, sucking, and generally emptying her little pink lips. She let out an unearthly moan and grabbed my head, settling me back down to really get busy with her. Meanwhile, she was making loud moans and screams and telling me in rather frank terms how good it felt. Then she would suddenly gasp and arch up in a bow, resting her back and ass on the spot where I was feasting on her. Her arms were raised above her head, her legs raised and spread wide, and she began a cadence of piercing screams. Then her legs and arms dropped back down onto the bed and she started shivering as if she had contracted a sudden severe case of malaria, still emitting those rhythmic screams. She reached down and took my head in both hands again. She started dragging me up her body, all the while screaming, "Get up here and fuck me. You have to fuck me now." I had to follow her lead or I could have lost both ears and possibly my entire head. She did all the work. As soon as I was nestled between her widely spread legs, she bucked up and in one motion drove me all the way into her. Not that she was loose. She was tight and very hot. But she was so lubricated. Then she turned into a mad woman, making low wild noises like an animal in heat and scratching my back in a way that I was sure I'd be wearing a t-shirt under my rope for a while. We fucked like that for about 20 minutes, me pounding her hard, her wriggling, moaning, and scratching like a wildcat. It's impossible to sustain that kind of stimulation for long. In my case, I could feel the orgasm approaching from somewhere far, far away, and when it came, I heard myself roaring like a rabid grizzly bear, "OHFUCKYSSSS." Meanwhile, Eva, who had been urging me louder and more furiously to come in her, seemed to have passed out. I didn't need to be a PA to realize this. I knew it because she was motionless beneath me. As I stepped out of her, she began to move, which caused me to groan with loss. Leaning back on my hands, I just stared at that adorable oval face with the long exquisite Swedish nose, sharply defined chin, and incredibly sculpted lips. Her icy blue eyes flew open and she looked stunned. I asked a little concerned, "Welcome back, are you all right?" She smiled languidly and replied, "I've never felt so good in my life. Do you know how I feel about you? Do you understand what I want?" I said, grinning slightly, "Well, let me see, maybe that's close to what I want." I want to wake up next to you every morning and work hard with you every day. I want to be your best friend and devoted lover. I want to see things and do things with you, have babies and die in your arms. Does that sound anything like what you wanted to say? The joyful expression that lit up her beautiful face told me everything. She wrapped her arms around my neck and her legs around my waist and screamed, "Yes. I want to be yours for the rest of our lives. I want to be your friend in the office and your lover the rest of the time. Everyone in town knows how I feel about you, except you, of course. You're a particularly dense specimen of the male species. But I know the whole town will have a parade when they find out." There was no parade. There was, however, a lot of congratulatory patting on the back. We were married 4 months later in a beautiful fall ceremony at the town's Lutheran church. There are as many Lutherans in small-town Wisconsin as there are Catholics in the Vatican. It was a community event, drawing hundreds of well-wishers, most of whom were our patients. Doris organized the reception. It was a dinner that could rival the feasts Julius Caesar threw for the Roman masses. Forgive me, Lord, but I had to admit that I loved Doris much more than I loved my own mother. In fact, Doris and Doc Morton were more like mother and father to me than my own parents. Doc and I had the kind of bond that a young man has with an older role model, and Doris made us feel especially safe, protected, and loved. Doris was a tough old Swedish bird who lived life to the fullest, never backing down in the face of hardship and always caring for those she loved. Watching Doris live her life goes a long way toward explaining my wife's invincible spirit. Doris simply possessed an extra dose of accumulated wisdom that made her even more appealing. She was in her 60s at the time. But she was still as energetic and inspiring as she had been when Eva was a child. The first thing Doris did when she became my mother-in-law was to change her house. She had a big 2-story stone colonial house that she and her husband had bought back in the 1970s. It looked like something out of a classic Andy Hardy movie, and it was a great place to raise kids. My little bungalow was very cozy and comfortable, and it was almost next door to Doris' diner. So it was both comfortable and much easier to maintain, for a woman who worked 10 hours a day. Doris probably could have retired. But it was like she was feeding off the energy of her home. 7 years passed in an exceptionally rewarding life. Eva was a wonderful friend, helper, and lover. Some couples like to socialize. We did, too. But mostly we just spent time together, working at the clinic and enjoying life as a married couple, completely content with each other. Our clinic was pretty much the only one in a 600-square-mile area, so we couldn't take long vacations. But we spent a lot of time outdoors, kayaking and hiking in the vast expanse of nature that surrounded us. Besides being the world's sexiest whore, Eva was a very intelligent woman with an outstanding sense of humor and exceptional nursing skills. She was so well-read that I didn't feel like we were stuck in the middle of Wisconsin. We had both seen too much evil and cruelty. So the peace and quiet of our lives was wonderfully restorative and invigorating. However, there was one dark cloud. Almost from the beginning of our marriage, we had been trying to have children. But Eva kept having miscarriages. We were both medical professionals. We realized she must have some kind of problem with her reproductive system. So finally, we made the 2.5-hour drive down the Mississippi to Rochester. Mayo was very sympathetic. But it turned out that Eva had some form of chronic cervical insufficiency that would likely prevent her from carrying the baby to term. Of course, there were surgical solutions. But they were invasive and prevented conception. The fact that Eva was 36 years old at the time further increased the odds against it. So in the end we just resigned ourselves to the fact that it would just be the two of us. It was a sad time. We both wanted children. However, fate decided to take away one of the most vivid experiences of our lives. Eva was particularly depressed. I kept telling her it didn't matter. But it took a blow to her feminine ego, and I could see that it threw her off her emotional balance. Basically, she became much more needy and less confident in our relationship. She used to be happy to express loving sadness to me about anything. Now, however, she held back from time to time. It also affected her sense of humor, which was even more frustrating in some respects. I dedicated myself to giving her the support she needed, and I knew she could handle it. Then Doc Morton died. He was in his mid-80s, so it wasn't a surprise. But he was a father, and his death knocked the support out from under the feet of my entire emotional and professional life. I missed his gentle wisdom and kind-hearted guidance. I am a person who believes that I can accomplish any task and am confident in my abilities. But like any human being, I sometimes need encouragement, especially after a particularly difficult day. If I needed reassurance, I could always count on Doc Morton and his decades of experience. Now, however, I was forced to handle everything in a rapidly growing practice all by myself. Even worse, I was required by law to be seen by a licensed physician. Geographically, we were a little closer to Mayo Clinic than Madison, and they have doctors licensed to practice in Wisconsin. So the UW solved the problem by asking one of the hotshots from Mayo to be the practice manager. This dude had to come in weekly and Skype daily to make sure we were operating within the law. We met this guy the Monday after Doc's funeral. I was still mired in grief, and Eva wasn't much better. I was sitting in the same chair I'd been sitting in when Eve walked through the door, almost 9 years ago. We were both a little nervous. That's what happens when you meet someone who has your fate in their hands. The door opened and a guy walked into the room. He was a couple years younger than me, about the same age as Eva. I knew from his bio that he was a prodigy, with brilliant academic and research achievements. But I didn't expect him to be so tall and roughly handsome. Usually in our area, movie stars don't pretend to be doctors. He cast a testing look at me, then turned his attention to Eve. I could almost hear the KHing sound in his head. It was a remarkably unprofessional introduction. He said, "I'm Dr. Chase Williams. I would prefer you call me Dr. or Williams or Dr. We must remain professional." I realized that this jerk wanted to show that he was exalted and we were both much less so. He turned to me and said, "I realize that the previous doctor kept you on a very long leash. I am not going to allow that to happen. Therefore, I need you to keep a log of your medical activities for my review. When I am here, both of you will need to coordinate any final medical recommendations with me." Exactly. He was also a raging control freak. I hated that asshole from day one. In the months that followed, I hated him even more. He treated me with contempt. It was his personal business, as if the fact that I was allowed to provide any form of medical care was some kind of perversion of the law. I realized I didn't have his medical credentials. But family medicine involves a lot of judgment, especially in diagnosis, and I had decades of experience keeping my patients healthy and happy. As a result, I took offense to his attitude. In fact, Dr. Dickhead would have been in big trouble with the locals if they had seen the way he treated me. But this guy was not only cunning but also smart. So he always belittled and humiliated me when it was just the two of us. On the other hand, he had the exact opposite attitude towards Eve. Dr. Dickbraith sang her praises. I could see that this reinforcement was helping her regain her shattered self-confidence. But it was too much. It wasn't jealousy. It was just a medical fact. Eva was an excellent doctor and nurse. But she wasn't the second coming of Florence Nightingale, as the jerk made her out to be. I began to suspect Dr. Hrenov's motives. He spent a lot of time invading Eva's personal space, leaning over her to read the cards, and putting his hand on her shoulder when he talked to her. It was inconspicuous, he couldn't be incriminated in any way. But it was clear that he was establishing his dominance. For her part, Eve seemed to like the attention. What woman wouldn't? The guy was rich, handsome, and walked around with the divine look that all the top doctors wore. She even occasionally flirted with him in an office-safe manner. I took it as a normal female reaction to a guy who clearly found her attractive, especially since I was sitting next to him. I had never doubted Eva's loyalty. She had been a lot of places, done a lot of things, and knew what she wanted. She made it clear to everyone around her that she loved me and went out of her way to prove our physical connection. She was respectful of our daily lives and was back to being as smart, energetic, and sarcastic as she had always been. I couldn't blame the guy for having a crush on Eva. She was almost 37 at the time, and she clearly surpassed all the women in the neighborhood in beauty, grace, elegance, and sophistication. When she passed her 30s, she changed her hair from a girl to a woman. She now wore a chic bob slicked forward into a pair of pointed wings that framed her gorgeous Swedish face. Only a woman with hair as thick as Eva's could create such a look. She hadn't lost a bit of her attractive body, but had only improved it. She had always been slender, words like flexible came to her mind. But she had added a little more of what guys like so much, a rounder ass and bigger breasts. It made her seem voluptuous and, frankly, very erotic. Dr. Krenev never missed an occasion like this. I caught him sneaking glances at Eva's ass as she bent over to pick up a file and asked him gloatingly, "What are you going to do about it?" Since he held all the legal cards, there wasn't much I could do about it except drop everything and leave the practice. Of course, I would never have done that, because at that point I was completely attached to the community. The problem was that Dr. Dopey was taking an increasingly aggressive interest in Eve. I don't think he was ever going to drive a wedge between us personally. But with his constant praise of her and his dismissive attitude toward me, he began to drive the two of us apart at work. In particular, he seemed hellbent on destroying our close professional relationship. Diagnosis is more of an art than a science. So inevitably there came a time when Eva and I found ourselves on different pages. We used to just discuss it for the good of the patient, our only aim was to do the best we could. Now, if there was a disagreement, Dr. Dickhead would turn it into a confrontation. Worse, he made it seem as if I was being arbitrary and condescending toward Eve, and he was always on her side. It was already starting to take its toll. As time went on, Eva started to take it out on me over little things. When she did, I would talk to her about it, as usual, and we would eventually work it out. But the increasingly frequent altercations began to get on both of our nerves. And then Dr. Hrenev escalated the situation. He made little hints that he thought I needed additional training. I took 100 hours of CME to keep my certification. But Dr. Williams decided I needed specialized training. Both Eva and I insisted that it wasn't necessary. But Dr. Asshole, in his always arrogant medical opinion, convinced the NCCPA that I could really use some tightening up. So the certifiers suggested in ominous tones that I do what the doctor ordered. So, I was sent to a 3-week emergency medicine and trauma course in Kansas City. Every night before I left, Eve was frantic. It was like she was trying to squeeze as much confidence as she could out of the time I had left. The trip itself was a waste of time. I had been a ranger medic for almost 6 years. So I could teach the instructors new things about emergency medicine and trauma care. For the first week, Eva and I talked every time I could carve out time for a break, morning, afternoon, and evening. She was bright and cheerful, with many charming incidents from Doris's diner. The second week the conversations got a little shorter, the anecdotes were still there, but Eve seemed distracted. The last week was frustrating. When I called, Eva was very curt. She said her patient load had increased and she didn't have time to talk. I knew what the patient load was like. So that excuse didn't make much sense. When I got home, Dr. Dickbright was in Rochester doing great things. The pressure was gone and I felt like old times. Eva had been a crazy woman all week. It happened every time we went to bed. I'd seen her needy before. But this was some new record of passion on her part. We talked and laughed and did all the things that make the Wisconsin Dells the perfect summer playground. But something about this situation wasn't right. I asked Eva what the problem was, and she said it was nothing. Nevertheless, I realized that something was bothering her. Dr. Krenev was extremely condescending when he finally decided to grace us with his presence. In fact, he was even more pissed off than usual. Eva's reaction was no less strange. Before I left, their relationship had been cordial and professional, maybe even a little flirtatious. Now Dr. Asshole was treating Eva the way he had always treated me, hypercritical and patronizing. I also noticed that he was snuggling up to her more often. These were not the kind of touches that would give rise to a sexual harassment lawsuit. It was just a little too possessive for my taste. So I did what I had always done in the past. I asked her about it. We were cozying up on the couch and watching TV. I thought, now is as good a time as any. So I bluntly asked Eva, "What's going on between you and Williams?" It was a simple question, asked in a neutral tone. She tensed and then said in an overly casual voice, "What makes you think there's something going on?" "What exactly are you asking me?" Well, I couldn't bluntly say, "I was wondering if you're fucking this guy." So instead I said, "I don't know. It just seems like there's something different between you and him. Maybe there's something that happened while I was gone that we need to talk about?" She tensed and replied carelessly, "Of course not." I let that pass my ears, but Eva raised more questions than she answered. For one thing, she was clearly hiding something. Moreover, the radical change in Dr. Dickbright's demeanor I could perceive in a number of ways. One possibility was that Eve had displeased the great man in some way. That was the simplest and most probable explanation. The other was much darker. The chilling thought occurred to me that perhaps they were putting on a show for me. If they were doing it very clumsily. Then Dr. Fuckface broke the big news. He told us that the State Department had asked Mayo to second him to Medicines Sans Frontieres in August. They wanted him to set up a center to diagnose and treat Chagas disease in Chiapas province, Mexico. I would have been glad to see him go, but he ended that statement by saying he wanted Eva to go with him. I exploded. I said angrily, "Why on earth would you ask my wife to accompany you to Mexico?" There was a threat in my voice, so he mockingly replied, "What's the matter, you don't want to help the poor migrant work? Heirs? I know you are too ignorant to understand the big picture. But your wife has a lot of valuable experience working in third world countries. In fact, she is the most qualified of all the nurses on my staff." I said angrily, "But she's not on your staff." He said, "She is now," I added her. "You do know that your contract is until you finish working at Mayo, right? So either she leaves or we close this clinic." I couldn't let that happen. I said, "This is blackmail," and turned to Eva. I said, "Eva, you don't have to leave. Just tell me and I'll leave. We can start somewhere else." We all knew I was bluffing. There was no other clinic within an hour's drive of here. I could see the pain she was in, and it made me even angrier. She was in the same position as me. She knew that our golden boy was turning her into his personal slave, holding the supervised clause over her head. It was wrong. But that's the way it is in the medical establishment. She said very hesitantly, "I'll go. It's only a month and we are doing the right thing. I have a lot of experience as a nurse in improvised settings. More importantly, I don't want to jeopardize what we've built here, so I'll do what Dr. Williams wants." She turned to Dr. Dickhead, "If I help you, I want your promise that you will stop supervising us and allow us to practice as we did before you came." The glint in the bastard's eyes was purely gloating. He turned to me and said gloatingly, "I knew you both would eventually figure it out my way." He might as well have said, "I knew you would eventually let me fuck your wife." I looked at Eve and she was devastated. I always wondered why she married her first husband. That guy looked like a gilded, narcissistic asshole, whereas Eva is gentle, sweet, kind and caring. The problem is that she's too nice, too polite, and willing to do anything to avoid confrontation, as happened in this case. Of course, most medics would have a hard time saying no to the opportunity to help the less fortunate. Eva had done the same for 3 mission trips. Besides, there was no real war in Mexico. She was upset that she would have to leave her husband and her happy home and live in the jungle for a few weeks. But the mission itself was humanitarian, and I could handle our workload alone. So theoretically, Dr. Dushabag's request was quite reasonable and perhaps permissible. However, everyone in the room knew the real reason he wanted to take Eve with him. He wanted her to be alone, and then he could pressure her to the fullest. I almost said it out loud. Unlike Eva, I have no problem with confrontation. But I knew a pitched battle would humiliate her. No woman wants her husband to question her fidelity, and that's exactly what I'd be seeking if I pressed federal charges about her being alone with Dr. Dushabag. So instead I said, "I need your assurance that Eva will be safe." He grinned and said, "Don't worry about that. I'll take very good care of her. The aftermath of this was almost unbearable. But in the end, I had to trust my wife and the deal was done. She tried to kill me the weekend before she left. On its own, this behavior wouldn't have been odd, but here was the subsequent tears that interested me. I asked anxiously, "What's the matter, Eva? Why are you so upset?" She replied through her tears, "I love you very much. I just can't bear to be separated from you." "Do you love me?" Now that was a serious question. I answered with sincere feelings, "Of course I love you. You are the only person I have ever truly loved. I love being married to you, and I will love you forever." This elicited a fake smile. She replied, "Sometimes I just can't handle my feelings." She flew out on a private jet provided by the State Department. She had the entire medical team with her. They departed from Rochester International Airport and flew directly to Palenque International Airport, with a necessary stopover for refueling. As I drove her 2.5 hours to the airport, we held hands, intertwining our fingers. Eva had served 4 years as a combat nurse in the Marine Corps. She was tough and used to deployments. But she looked miserable. It was an Army C-37B, which in civilian parlance is called a Gulfstream G550. I thought, only the best for Dr. Mudak. I watched the entire team board, 17 people, support staff, other nurses, Eva, and asshole himself. Eva cast one last anguished look at me as she came aboard. Then they rolled out and disappeared into the gray overcast. I found it hard to look through my tears. In the meantime, I needed to run the clinic and care for patients. Considerations such as duty meant everything to me. In the evening, Eva called. She was in the hostel they had organized outside Palenque at the Technical University. She said she was living in a dorm room. But the university itself turned out to be a surprisingly nice place, surprisingly modern. We talked for a long time. She was in the mood to remember all the good times. I called her again on Monday night. She said the first day had been spent mostly in meetings. She said she was bored and desperately lonely. I sympathized with her, as that fit my situation in Kansas City just fine. She said that tomorrow the administrative team is going to scout out a couple of sites for the clinic. She said it would be just her, the head nurse, Dr. Dickbrate, a representative from the State Department, and 3 nurses. They had several places in mind. They were all in desperately poor and overcrowded parts of the city. She said, "Don't worry, I'll never be alone with him." Bless her, she knew exactly what I was thinking. I called her on Tuesday, but there was no answer. I called her cell phone all day. There was still no answer. Tuesday turned into a Wednesday with no sleep. I called probably 1,000,000 times. Her phone seemed to be off. I have no idea how I managed to work that day. But doing useful things can help one get through a lot of anxiety. Nevertheless, the waiting was becoming agonizing. So I decided to go to Rochester. I called the receptionist and asked her to tell tomorrow's patients that I had an unavoidable emergency and to reschedule the appointment. Just as I was gathering my coat, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found Doris on the porch. I said, "Doris, it's good to see you. But I have to go." She stiffly ushered me into the house. It was so unexpected that I said with irritation, "I really have to go, Doris." She looked at me grimly and said, "You'll listen to me if you care about your wife and my only child." I felt the walls closing in. I walked over to a chair, sat down to regain my balance, took a deep breath and said, "Tell me everything. Don't hold anything back." Doris is of Viking lineage, and in her gaze toward me, you could see her heritage of blood and mayhem. She said, "You probably guessed that Eva had a problem with Dr. Williams." So it was true. I nodded my head in agreement. He was hitting on her every minute you were away, getting too close to her, groping her, and making intrusive remarks. She tried to avoid him. But he got more and more brazen until he attacked her in one of the examining rooms. I must have looked horrified, because Doris added hastily, she broke free of him and ran to me. I went back to the clinic and cornered the varmint. He was very smug and acted as if groping nurses was a doctor's right. I told him explicitly what the people of this town would do to him if I said a word about what he had just done to Eva. I thought, that explains Eva's strange behavior. It also explains why she didn't tell me. She knew I would have killed the bastard, consequences be damned. And then it hit me. It completely confirmed Dr. Dern's sudden interest in helping the people of Mexico. He wanted to get Eve away from her support system. My anxiety level spiked. Doris gave me the basilisk look she uses to freeze unruly customers and said with emphasis, "That's not why I'm here." Eve instructed me to contact her on an emergency basis. I looked stunned. I asked, "Why you and not me?" Doris replied fondly, "She didn't want to add to your worries. She was going away with Dr. Williams. It was bad enough. She didn't want to make it worse by implying that the area was so dangerous that she needed emergency contact. She knew I would tell you if anything happened." Then she added, starting to lose her composure, "I just got a call that Eva's car was found abandoned near one of the archaeological dig sites. Her group was working in a bad part of town and it's assumed they were kidnapped." I knew that kidnapping was not an entirely unheard of activity for some elements down there. Then Doris added grimly, "A government spokesman said they are negotiating with the Mexican authorities to get them back safely." I was shocked. My Eva, the love of my life, had been kidnapped by a gang of Mexican thugs, and the people who put her in this situation wanted really bad? Every second my wife was in the clutches of these beasts was unnecessary. Some people can go to church and pray. But the Rangers lead the way. So I knew what I had to do, and it never occurred to me to do otherwise. My decision to go out there and handle it myself wasn't as idiotic and self-serving as it might seem. Hostage rescue is my specialty, and this wasn't my first time at the rodeo, or even my fifth. It's just that we've always worked as a team before. This time, all the planning and execution would be on me. I said, "Don't worry, Doris. I'll get her back. Just tell the patients that the clinic is closed for a while, and I'll take care of the rest." The flight out of O'Hare was at 5:45 in the morning. He was flying to Killeen, Texas. That gave me time to make the necessary calls. You may wonder why I flew to Killeen and not directly to Palenque. Well, it would have taken me almost 20 hours to get to Palenque by air with all the connections and transfers. I didn't have a fancy private jet at my disposal like Dr. Dishabag. At the same time, from Killeen to Palenque, I could get from Killeen to Palenque by car in about 24 hours. Of course, that wasn't the main reason I was driving. First, I needed to stop and pick up a few necessities in Killeen. Fort Hood is home to the 4th Infantry Division, and many of my battle buddies were assigned to that division. So when I left security on a cloudless Texas morning, there were 2 fraternity men waiting for me. They were busy while I was traveling. We shook hands. But we didn't waste any time. They briskly escorted me to a Ford Explorer that was parked on the curb. The driver jumped out of the car, we shook hands, too, and I drove down Highway 281, heading for McAllen and the Rio Grande. I arrived at McAllen at 1 p.m. The border search was simple. I didn't look suspicious. I looked military, with obvious high and sturdy weapons. They quickly inspected the car and used the mirrors. Then they let me through. Everything I needed was attached to the frame of the car, it was unrecognizable. I would pack it up when I reached my destination. The rest of the stuff looked like photo equipment for tourists. The journey down the east coast of Mexico was at desperate speeds. So it actually took less than 20 hours. Doris kept me supplied with information all along the way. 2 of those who were with Eva stayed at the kidnapping site to deliver the ransom demand. No one from that part of town had seen anything. That's to be expected. Groups that commit crimes like this can be very close and violent to people who see something. Members of Eva's group said they thought it was a local bandit gang, not a cartel or guerrilla unit. But they had no idea where they were headed. Eva's abandoned car was found at an archaeological dig site. So I decided to start there. I arrived at the parking lot at 4 p.m. on Friday. I walked 300 yards down a long tree-lined trail to the site. The heat was incredible and the jungle around me was alive with movement and sounds. The noise of monkeys and birds reminded me of something out of a Tarzan movie. The site itself was a classic UNESCO tourist attraction with very well-kept Mayan ruins. It was located at a higher elevation than the surrounding jungle, which was fortunate because to my right I could see one of the traditional Mayan staircase temples. From its summit I could see the jungle for miles. I had assumed all along that the kidnappers would go into the jungle from where they had abandoned the car. That's why I took the Flair T1020 infrared forward-looking system with me. If there was any heat source in the surrounding jungle, I could see it from the top of the pyramid. I also had a pair of third-generation Armasight in-15 military night vision goggles. With them I could navigate whatever I saw. With those goggles I could see high noon and I thought the analogy was apt. My last specialty gear was a Baradam 107A1 with a Leupold Mark 8 M5B2 tactical scope and suppressor. Only the government has access to that kind of gear. My friends loaned it to me for a while. From a quarter-mile range I could put 3 661 grain cartridges into the palm of my hand, and our best snipers thought I was a bad shot. They could do the same thing from over a mile away. The decommissioned M107 parts were strapped under the SUV. Otherwise, I was sure I would arouse suspicion if I tried to drive into Mexico with a sniper rifle nearly 5 feet long in the back seat. Of course, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near an archaeological dig after dark. So I booked a room at Marguerite and Ed's Cabana. I expected to see a third-world establishment with hot pillows. But what I got were quaint little huts tucked among the trees of the rainforest. There were the usual number of small lizards, but no bedbugs, and everything was much nicer and more modern than I expected. Even more important was that I had managed to secure the outermost block behind me. So I wouldn't have to climb out of the bathroom window to sneak into the jungle. Everything must be dark and desolate for me to begin my journey. I had only gotten 4 hours of sleep in the previous 40 hours, and at Rangers you learn to sleep when you get the chance. So I set my alarm for 11:30 and slept another 4. At midnight I was well rested and with all my gear I was moving southwest through the jungle. I was aiming for the ruins. It was literally like broad daylight if you put your goggles on. So it was relatively easy going if you set aside all the rainforest crap, including one very large and scary looking snake. The archaeological site itself had been cleared. Therefore, to remain undetected, I had to go completely around it. As I climbed to the top of the pyramid, there was no hiding place. But once I got up there, I could take cover. I checked the immediate surroundings with the Flair. Nothing was visible, not even a guard. So I climbed up the narrow steps of the Temple of Inscriptions and found a spot at the top from where I could observe. I expected to have to keep watch all night and probably a few more nights. But as soon as I turned on the Flair, I saw a large hotspot on a volcanic mountain about 10 miles to the west. It lit up the Flair as if there was a Cinco de Mayo festival going on there. A small campfire and bodies were generating a lot of heat. So it was clearly a camp, even if it was completely invisible to the naked eye. I thought, really? These guys are clearly not criminal masterminds. Of course, the night was pitch black, and infrared detection might not be something a cholo knows about. Maybe that was my goal, maybe not. I didn't know at that point. It was 11:30 p.m., with about 7 hours until dawn, and I decided to sneak over to this camp to see what I could see. In the years that I had been out of the Rangers, I had never once lost physical fitness. So the 10 miles took me a little over 2.5 hours. I had to move up the slope. But when I got there, I found rocks and ledges above my goal. I poked around until I found the perfect spot for a sniper's nest. The Flair showed a dozen heat sources. 4 of them were indistinct, in a sort of makeshift tin hut. The other 8 heat sources were spread across a small clearing in front of the hut. Most of them appeared to be asleep. They had a campfire burning, which created a halo that obscured part of the infrared picture. I was still a quarter mile away from them, and even with the superior resolution of my night vision goggles, it was impossible to tell if these were the guys. The important thing was to make sure they were the exact cocksuckers holding Eve. Because if they were, I was going to make sure they all died. I left the Florin Barrett at the tip of the promontory and made the final quarter-mile trek to my targets. I was wearing a black, tight-fitting, light-absorbing ballistic nylon tactical suit and a balaclava. I was invisible in the dark unless someone was standing next to me. I carried a K-bar and an M9 Beretta. These were my standard ranger weapons and I felt comfortable with them. When I reached the camp, I saw several vaqueros awake, acting as guards. They were smoking and talking. As I walked around the clearing, I heard one of them say something to the other. They both laughed loudly. Then the one who had been talking got up and went into the hut. A commotion started, then there was a shout, a slap, and soon after a loud ugh, the grunt of a woman being fucked to the fullest. It was a disgusting sound, but it confirmed what I had suspected, it was the same guys. I just hoped I hadn't heard it was Eve. A couple of the others were awakened by the sounds of sex coming from the cabin. They got up slowly and crept inside to get in line. Meanwhile, I was moving as fast as I could toward my sniper's nest. When I reached it, it took me a second to calm down. The thought of my angel being raped by some dirty thug made my heart beat more often than it needed to for a shot, even at the relatively easy distance of 400 yards. I took a few cleansing breaths and silently focused the crosshairs of the Barrett Universal Night Sight on the guy sleeping farthest from the fire. A bullet hit from a Barrett isn't that insignificant. So I planned to kill the one who was least visible, and then sneak over to the one sleeping closest to the fire. You may ask why I didn't just go in with my gun drawn? The answer is that I am a smart and disciplined ranger. They had AK-47s. So from a tactical standpoint, the odds were on the side of 8 assholes with automatic weapons, not one guy with 15 rounds in his melee pistol. More importantly, I was Eve's last hope. If they killed me, they would bury all of our bodies in a hole in the rainforest, after Eve had survived a few hours of unspeakable horror. I wanted to be buried next to my wife, but not that way. So I had to level the playing field as much as possible. In fact, if I was lucky and if they were stupid enough, I could end the game right here and now. But first I had to face the devil inside me. I had to convince myself that what I was doing was just. I was a soldier. I've killed many times. But it was all in the heat of battle. It's never easy. But it is something that can be done for the right reasons. On the other hand, it takes strong nerves to shoot a sleeping man. There's no honor here. There is no bravery. It's an execution, plain and simple. I told myself that I was simply removing the barriers between me and my beloved, and had no sympathy for my targets. It was their actions that brought death to their doorstep. I was but an agent to set the inevitable price. But beyond all that, I was particularly uncomfortable killing these very people. For I was certain that one of them had already raped my wife. The suppressor silenced the shot. The only indication that my target had gone to the great fiesta in the sky was the sud. Den movement he made when the .50 caliber bullet hit him in the side. I moved to the next guy who was just starting to recover from the rather loud thump of the impact. It must have sounded like someone dropped a heavy log on the ground next to him. I was aiming for their bodies. Heads are hard to hit, and I didn't need the spray. But more importantly, a .50 caliber bullet can really mess you up. The bullet is 3 times larger than the high-velocity 5.56mm round the M4 fires, and they have almost the same muzzle velocity. So there was no need to worry about just wounding those bastards. If you hit a man in the chest with a .50 caliber, he'll die from hydrostatic shock no matter where exactly you hit. Even better if the bullet goes into the ground. That way they would look peaceful, lying in the dark after the impact. I systematically massacred 4 of them that way, silently and without remorse. The guard was next. His death must have alerted the others, for he stood in front of the door, watching and chuckling. When I put a bullet between his shoulder blades, all hell broke loose. The hit scattered everyone in the hut, which alerted the vaqueros inside to the danger. But it was very dark, and without night vision, everything was completely unclear. The 2 guys watching the show were stupid enough to jump out with automatic rifles at the ready. The genius to my right died just like his friends. This time he hit the center. The other hid behind the wall next to the door. At 400 yards, a high-velocity 50 caliber bullet will go through tin plate as if it wasn't there. It will do the same to wood or plaster. The flair showed my target standing with his back to the wall, next to a door peeking out of the opening. I took aim and fired at the wall. Flair recorded a pile of slowly cooling flesh on the floor. The last guy grabbed the woman he was raping and dragged her out the door. She was screaming and begging. He stood in the open, naked from the waist down, holding a gun to her head. Seriously. He must have been at the end of the line when the brains were handed out. 7 of his comrades had just died at the hands of an invisible killer, and this idiot was standing in the open waving a gun around? I did humanity a favor by removing him from the gene pool. Most of his body was covered by a woman who, thank God, was not Eve. I don't like headshots. They have a low hit percentage even from such a short distance. Worse, I had no idea if there was anything behind his back if I missed. But I had to take the shot. So I slowed my breathing and heart rate and literally blew his head off. As I approached the hut, screams came from inside. My heart broke at the thought that my precious angel was one of them. I was still in my tight-fitting tactile suit with balaclava and night vision goggles. When I walked through the door, the 4 terrified people must have thought they had been invaded by Martians. Eve was tied to the wall, screaming and crying like everyone else. But she was alive. I could see them all very clearly, while they saw only a ghostly shadow. My first thought was to run up and take Eve in my arms, but I wanted to give her a second to calm down. So I stood beside her and said in the softest, most soothing tone I was capable of, "It's okay, baby girl. The bad guys are dead." There was a pregnant pause, and Eva looked at me with surprise on her face. She said with pathetic hope in her voice, "Jonathan?" I replied, "Yes, my love, I am here to take you home." During my time in the army, I served with a lot of tough guys. But my wife, a Viking Shield maiden, proved to me that she was the toughest person I knew. She had been kidnapped, possibly raped, and certainly abused. But that didn't stop her from saying in a surprisingly calm and ironic tone, "What took you so long?" I laughed. It was how we always bantered with each other, and given the situation, it was an incredibly bold and intimate gesture. There were 3 women and 1 man. The man was Dr. Dickbrate. The woman who had been raped was one of the younger nurses, a pretty babe who had become an empty pretender to humanity, lying naked in front of the cubicle. The other woman was also young and quite beautiful. The 8 Mexican thugs who had left were evidently going to have a party. I regretted their horrible deaths even less. I cut Eva's bonds with the K-bar and whispered, "Let's go outside." I didn't really need to whisper. Because Dr. Douchebag was making an incredible noise, crying, screaming, and begging for mercy. I understood that he feared for his life. But it was especially unmanly to humiliate himself. I almost went up to him to gloat. But I knew I had to disappear without a trace. I helped Eve to her feet. She was in a lot of pain. Part of it was just from being tied up for so long. I didn't want to even think about what the other reason might be. I had to take her out of the hut because she couldn't see anything. An ordinary man might have been frightened if he had been led blindly in pitch darkness. But my wife was as trustingly brave as she was beautiful. As I led her outside, into the firelight, I removed my balaclava and goggles. She threw her arms around my neck, clung to me, and began to wail, "Oh my God, Jonathan, how did you find us? Where are the people who held us?" Her body shook with a fit of shock. I said with a sense of deep satisfaction, "They have been finally removed from the equation. Now I need you to brace yourself some more or I'm going to be in big trouble." That quickly brought her back to her previous state of mind. She was dirty, her golden hair disheveled, and she was wearing her usual hiking shorts and boots. But her blouse was almost completely torn, and she was not wearing a bra, so her huge, gorgeous breasts were sticking out. I didn't speculate on the reasons for this, or I would have had to cut off every one of their cocks and shove them down their dead throats. I said, "I have just executed 8 Mexicans. Of course, it was done to save the lives of 4 Americans. But I am a private citizen, and the authorities will consider my actions a lynching." so no one can find out who did it. I'll leave you the knife and my gun. I pulled the safety off the M9 and held it out to her with the butt forward. It had been made anonymous before I picked it up, and Eve is very good with a gun. Then I added, "You'll have to get the other 3 out of here. There's a small farm road about 1.5 miles in that direction." I pointed east. My voice trembled with excitement as I spoke. "I know you can do it, my brave wife." I finished with all the love and anxiety I had felt for the past 72 hours. "I love you, my angel, and the next time I see you it will be in our happy home. But soon the sun will rise and I have a long walk ahead of me." I pulled her against me and we kissed with a passion driven by what we were going through. We would talk about this at another time and place. I knew this fearless woman would not let us down. When full dawn came, I was still in the rainforest. I had passed the archaeological dig site, but was still about half a mile from the resort. I might arouse suspicion if anyone spotted me strolling around in black tactical gear, with a sniper rifle and a backpack full of 21st century electronics. So I took my time and tried to be inconspicuous. I discreetly slipped into my hut while the residents went to breakfast. 15 minutes later I came out to join them. I was dressed in plaid Bermuda shorts and a garish aloha shirt with a cheap Panama hat. I wanted to look like the biggest homo in the entire state of Chiapas. I certainly didn't want anyone to connect me to any deadly night stalkers that might be operating in the neighborhood. After breakfast, I loudly let everyone know I was going. "Look at all that old shit up there on the hill." My goal was to give the impression that I was obnoxiously ignorant. News travels fast in Mexico, almost like small-town Wisconsin. When I arrived at the archaeological site, everyone from old ladies selling souvenirs to tour guides were talking about it. It seems that one farmer was making his way down the road toward El Naranjo when he came across a group of haggard and dirty Americans. They told him a fantastic story about how their captors had been killed by an alien creature with strange beady eyes. The locals didn't understand how one entity could kill 8 tough guys so easily. So they willingly bought the rumors of an alien invasion. They said that the leader of the group of captives was a determined American woman armed with a knife and a gun. She said she had taken these weapons from one of their dead captors. I thought, good girl Eva. The 4 captives were being prepared for transportation to Bethesda, simply out of precaution. The women had all been raped, and the man had broken ribs, a slightly fractured skull, and badly damaged testicles during the beating. The State Department briefed them. But none of them saw anything but the alien. Naturally, this story was immediately dismissed by the authorities. But they had no better explanation anyway. It was sensational news because the captives were all part of a humanitarian medical team. The Mexican government condemned the actions of several rogue citizens. The U.S. government was reviewing its entire policy on humanitarian assistance. In short, it was the usual ass-covering, bureaucratic piling on, signifying nothing. I took a leisurely drive back to Killeen. A few extra things were strapped into my Explorer. I handed my brothers the keys. We shook hands and I boarded the flight to O'Hare. I picked up my car in the parking lot and was back seeing patients at the clinic on Monday morning. It was a short and relaxing 4-day vacation. At least that was my story, and I stuck to it. Meanwhile, Doris was with Eva in Bethesda. I did not visit her while she was there. My excuse was the need to run our clinic. Both women knew the real reason. I couldn't draw attention to myself. If the press ever found out I was an ex-ranger, they might dig a little deeper and find 8 bodies. I couldn't let that happen, of course. The doctors in Bethesda found that Eva was surprisingly healthy, both physically and mentally. This did not surprise me in the least. Eva had always been a very strong woman, capable of making sensible decisions about her life. Shit happens from time to time. The true measure of a person's resilience is what happens after. Rape is an abuse of a woman's soul. Therefore, the worst outcome of rape can be the complete destruction of her psyche. I knew my Eve wouldn't let those 8 low-life bastards do that to her. It wasn't that she was in denial. She knew exactly what had been done to her. She just had too much inner strength and spiritual integrity to let that dictate everything that happened next. Instead, she made a conscious decision to move on with unwavering courage. I waited for her in our peaceful home when she returned to Wisconsin. The last time I saw her, she was scared, hungry, and exhausted. This woman in front of me had gone through her own personal valley of death and came out the other side resilient and victorious. I've known guys who've been through this kind of violence, shootings, gunfire, or IEDs, and they've always had that hunted look in their eyes. Eva didn't have that. She'd been through much worse. But she looked calm, peaceful, and dazzlingly beautiful. Her valor was worthy of a medal. She closed the door and leaned her back against it. She looked around, as if enjoying the calm harbor after a big storm. I just stood there while she took control of her emotions. Then she rushed over to me, wrapped her arms around me and hugged me like she would never let me go. I looked at her tear-stained face, and we kissed for the first time since we'd been in the middle of all this mess. The kiss lasted a long time. I said, "Welcome home, my love." She replied, "Oh my God, Jonathan, I never thought I would see you again." She then pulled me to her and gave me an even longer kiss. I wanted to fuck her so badly that my teeth ached. But I deliberately held back, thinking about what she was going through. Of course, she read my mind. She asked from below, near my chest, "Did killing those men change you?" I laughed and replied, "They weren't men. They were rabid animals. Knowing what they probably did to you, I actually enjoyed every second of it." She said with wisdom in every syllable, "I feel the same way. As far as I'm concerned, our love is still pure and untouched. Whatever they did to my body, they did not touch me. I was strengthened within myself by my love for you and our life together." Every second of that disgusting time I took refuge behind the adamantium walls of that commitment. I will never let those vile things tarnish the soul I gave to you. I looked into her incredible ice blue eyes. They looked at me with a deep hunger. I even spoke out loud, "Are you sure about that?" She replied with loving irony in her voice, "I've never been so sure of anything in my life. I need to burn this experience out of me, and you are the only person who can do that. So let's get to therapy." She wasn't kidding. As soon as we reached our bedroom, she immediately threw off her dress, got out of her panties and unhooked her bra, all on the bed. At 38, she was in the prime of her life. She had always been slim and trim, with a particularly firm round ass. When she walked, that ass swayed mesmerizingly. Her magnificent back was impeccably muscular. She turned to face me and presented herself with a confident, feminine smile on her face. She knew how striking she was. Her figure resembled an anatomical diagram labeled female, long waist and firm round hips, long legs of perfect proportion and gorgeous plump tits with big pink nipples pointing at me like little fingers. I stood in shock as I always did when I saw her like that. She was too beautiful for a small-town guy like me. But she was mine, and I wasn't about to let her go. I let out a growl of delight, walked over, and took her into my arms, fully clothed. We kissed passionately again. Then she leaned back and said, "Aren't you forgetting something?" She looked intently at me standing there in my shirt and khakis. She said with a smirk, "You better fix that problem quickly or I'll start the celebration without you." About 3 seconds later, I already had her in my arms as we lay naked in our bed. She slid into me with a slight moan of satisfaction. It was as if she had immersed herself in a healing bath. I slowly stroked her round thigh and sides and she almost purred with pleasure. It would be a classic husband and wife fuck, no tricks, nothing to remind her of the cruelty she had just endured. It would be gentle, loving and slow. At least that was the concept. But Eva had other ideas. We kissed lovingly again, and I was just beginning to gently lay her back on the bed when she let out a strangled cry, sat up straight, turned around, and slapped me on the back. She then threw one of her glistening thighs over me and with a loud groan, sat down herself. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it took me a second to assess if she felt the same as she did before. I quickly discovered that she was just as tight, wet, and hot as before. She let out a horrible scream of need and started swinging her hips at near supersonic speed. She wasn't kidding. She was clearly squeezing the full experience out of her soul with this act. As she began to move back and forth, she threw her head back and just screamed her desire all over the beautiful Wisconsin countryside. The thrusts of her hips were getting me to this state much faster than I wanted. Then she made it worse, leaning over and plopping one of those perfect nipples on my face, never stopping the up and down motion. I pressed my lips against one of her big hot nipples and she just exploded. She said in a very loud voice, "Ah. I'm coming, oh God, I'm coming," and she sprawled on top of me and her hips went into full force. I wrapped my arms around her upper body as she wriggled and screamed with the emotions overwhelming her. When she was through with that monstrous orgasm, I picked her up and rolled her over onto her back, still hard as a titan inside her. She asked in a delighted tone, "Again?" I didn't answer her. I pulled her knees up to her shoulders and began to pound her insistently. When I brought myself to a life-destroying orgasm, the wet spanks were like pistol shots. But she was ahead of me. She started grunting, like a machine gun. Her hips began to move haphazardly, and then she started making sounds that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. It could have been called an orgasm. But it was more like being punched in the stomach with a fist. The contractions were so strong that her passage was gripping me like we were welded together. The sensation made me come like the Midnight Express. It felt like the entire universe had shrunk to the original point of light that formed the Big Bang, and then disturbing and mysterious things started happening in my reproductive system. I must have pumped all of my body's sperm into her. She kept screaming that I was filling her up and then suddenly went limp. She holds her breath when she comes, and she cummed almost continuously for several minutes. When I came back to my senses to think about her, I found her lying there exhausted, breathing quietly. I gazed into that beautiful Swedish face with its exquisite high cheekbones, perfect Scandinavian nose, and incredibly full sculpted lips. It was the most insanely beautiful sight I had ever seen. Then she opened one eye and looked me over. She was like a Karelian lake, dark blue and bottomless. She said with deep feeling, "Thank you, my darling. It is only because of our love that I survived. We made love all weekend." I told Eva that I was ready to talk about anything she wanted to talk about. But she said there was nothing to talk about. In her mind, this whole horrible thing had happened in a universe far, far away. Now she was where she should be, where she had always wanted to be, and that was all she cared about. Doris came over with the usual Sunday feast, and we spent all Sunday wrapped up in a blanket of family comfort. When we went to bed, I said, "Your mom told me about your problems with Williams." She looked at me grimly and replied, "I'm going to take care of it early tomorrow morning. He's never touched me before. But if I get my way, that over-entitled sack of shit will never practice medicine again." I meekly replied, "You should have told me." She looked at me with genuine disbelief and said, "So what? You killed him? I love you too much to put you behind bars for the rest of your life. And I knew that's what would happen if I told you." She was right. It wouldn't be a pretty sight. Then she got serious and said, "When he planted this trip on us, I was gathering evidence to support my sexual harassment complaint. I knew he was just trying to leave me alone to work on me. That smug prick really thinks every woman he meets wants to fuck him." She laughed mockingly and added, as if that's what was supposed to happen, "He didn't even realize that my phone recorder was on the whole time he was proposing to me." Wow. I would have sent a thank you note to the guys who systematically and brutally beat the bastard. But unfortunately, they were all dead. Then she smiled slyly and said, "The fact that I'm in danger because of his machinations is only an eye-opener. I'm not just going to file a complaint. I'm going to sue Mayo for negligence for allowing such a horny dog to boss any woman around. When I'm done, I can guarantee that our life will be what it was before he was in it." I mentally noted that I would never joke with my loving wife. She's a little more ferocious than a mama grizzly, at least when it comes to the one she loves. In fact, she was a lot like her mother Doris. I turned off the light, and we lay under the blanket, pressed against each other, the two of us. I wrapped my arms around her supple waist, and she pressed her two sexy buns against me. Of course, this piqued my interest. She sleepily asked, "Again?" I replied, "Again." And we spent the night making sweet satisfying love in our quiet house in a happy little town in Wisconsin. Epilogue. The Mayo Company was so eager to satisfy Eva's complaint that they sent a whole platoon of high-profile suits to negotiate terms. They realized how much they had been set up to be screwed. Apparently Dr. Dern had experience with similar incidents in Rochester, which is why they sent him to the wilds of Wisconsin. That Eve had recorded evidence that she had been harassed at the clinic was bad. But she also had proof that she had been assaulted, raped, and potentially killed as a result of Dr. Dickhead's scheming. They were desperate to make her forget all that. So they offered millions. We flatly refused. All we wanted was our simple life back. So we agreed to their ironclad commitment to guarantee our professional independence within the minimum legal requirements. Then we returned to primary care practice. Needless to say, the AMA was not happy with Dr. Dickhead. It takes a lot to get a license revoked, but they went as far as they could in the process. They also made it clear that any further lapses would guarantee that he would be practicing medicine in some place like Uruguay because he would not have a license in the US. They also made sure to publicize their problems with him in the medical community. The last anyone heard was that he was working at a clinic in Nome, Alaska. There he didn't have to worry about freezing his dick off. The Mexicans took care of that. 7 months have passed. Every day was filled with love and pleasant work. And in January of 39, Eva announced that she was pregnant. She was ecstatic. I reminded her of what the doctors had told us. She said that during her gynecological exams, the doctors at Bethesda had diagnosed a cervical insufficiency and had corrected it with microsurgical sutures. Eva told me that their main concern was that the fix would prevent her from getting pregnant. But since she was already pregnant, it was a moot point. We could expect the happy event in 6 months. Eva wanted a baby so badly that she spent the last 2 months in bed. The whole town followed the events of the last few weeks more than the events at Lambeau Field, which should give you an idea of how important the birth was to all those good-hearted people. Doris was omnipresent, feeding, training and fluffing Eve's pillows. We were close enough to the date of natural labor that the doctors in Madison decided to do an induction. The night before, a parade of cars followed us down US 90 to the University of Wisconsin Hospital. The whole town wanted to be present for this happy event. I was with Eva throughout the birth. She may be 39 years old. But she has the strength and energy of a much younger woman. Little Brooklyn came into the world at 2:19 p.m. on a gorgeous October afternoon. The sun outside was literally flooding the delivery room with golden light. All that seemed to be missing were the heavenly trumpets. Brookie complained loudly about her treatment as she was placed on the table to be cleaned up. I went over to her to talk to her. I said, "I want to introduce myself, my little lump of love. I am your daddy, and your happiness will be my obsession for life." My little angel stopped fussing and focused her bright blue eyes on me. It was an eerily normal look for someone who had only been alive for 5 minutes. Then she reached for the finger I was holding out to her. She took it in her tiny hand, held it up, and looked at me calmly. Perhaps she recognized my voice from all the times I had spoken to her in the womb, or maybe it was just a reflex. Nevertheless, this simple act cemented a bond between me, my wife, and my child that only a husband and father can understand. It was then that I realized it was all worth it.